Hey there. Today's deep dive takes us into some fascinating cultural beliefs about evil,
Hmm.
specifically the Greek evil eye and African witchcraft.
Yeah.
You've given us some really interesting research to dig into, mostly from a sociological perspective.
Okay.
We're going to explore how these beliefs work in their own cultures and unpack why comparing them to Western ideas of evil can get a little tricky.
What's fascinating to me is we're not just talking about evil as this abstract idea.
Right.
We're looking at how different cultures actually experience it, how they explain it, and what they do about it.
Right. It's like, what does evil look like in everyday life?
Yeah.
And that's where the Greek evil eye and African witchcraft come in. Let's start by getting a clear picture of each one, based on what we've got here in the research.
Okay, so with the evil eye, the core idea is that someone can harm you just by looking at you,
Whoa.
and it usually comes from a place of envy or jealousy. Think of it like someone being so envious of your new car
Yeah.
that they accidentally give you the evil eye, and
Oh.
suddenly you get a flat tire.
Wow, so like bad vibes, but with real world consequences.
Exactly. And the research even breaks it down further, making a distinction between unintentional harm, called matiasma, and intentional harm, which is called vascenia.
Okay.
So you could get the evil eye from someone who doesn't even realize they're doing it.
That's kind of unsettling. Like, how can you protect yourself if you don't even know where the bad vibes are coming from?
But that's where things like amulets and certain rituals come in, trying to ward off those negative energies.
Uh-huh.
But we'll get into those details a little bit later.
Got it. So let's switch gears for a second and talk about African witchcraft. This seems way more intense than a sideways glance, right?
It definitely involves a different worldview. In many African cultures, witchcraft is a way to explain why bad things happen,
Okay.
like illness accidents or
Right.
crop failures.
Yeah.
And it often involves rituals and spiritual forces, not just a look.
So like tapping into supernatural powers to either cause harm or protect yourself from it.
Yes, and one of the key points this research makes is that both the evil eye and witchcraft share this common thread of envy.
Wait, so you're saying envy is like the fuel behind both?
Exactly. Think about it. If someone has something you desperately want, whether it's material possessions, good health,
Yeah.
or even just luck, envy can twist into a desire to see them lose it or suffer. In the case of the evil eye, it might be an unconscious impulse, while in witchcraft, it's often seen as a deliberate act.
Makes you think twice about casually admiring someone's success, huh? You don't want to accidentally give them the evil eye.
Right. Now, one expert cited in the research, Van Wyck,
Okay.
talks about how in many African societies, envy is often rooted in scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
When resources are limited and people are struggling to survive, jealousy can become a powerful motivator for witchcraft accusations.
So it's not just about individual envy, but also tied to broader social and economic pressures.
Precisely. And this is where things start to get really interesting, where we compare the Greek evil eye and African witchcraft in their social context.
Okay, let's dive into that. So how does the evil eye play out in Greek society? Is it like a constant fear or more of a background hum?
It's more like a set of social rules, almost like an unspoken code of conduct.
Okay.
Because if you believe that envy can cause real harm, you're probably less likely to flaunt your wealth or brag about your accomplishments.
Makes sense. You don't want to attract those envious glances.
Right, the research actually cites another expert, Eliot, who argues that the evil eye belief system thrived in ancient Greece because it was a way to regulate social behavior in a world where resources were often scarce and competition was fierce.
So it was like a built-in mechanism to prevent social unrest and maintain some level of harmony?
Exactly. It encouraged generosity and humility, kind of like a subtle pressure to share your good fortune
Yeah.
and not make others feel bad about their own lack.
Okay, so in Greece, it's about keeping the social fabric intact. What about in African societies? How does the belief in witchcraft affect how people interact with each other?
Well, as we've mentioned, African witchcraft is often seen as a way to explain misfortune. But unfortunately, this can sometimes lead to suspicions and accusations within communities.
Like, if your crops fail, it's not just bad luck. It's because someone put a curse on you.
Yes, and the research highlights how this can create a climate of fear and mistrust. Particularly in communities where resources are limited, people start to see each other as potential rivals, even threats,
Yeah.
which can be incredibly divisive.
Wow. So it's not just about explaining misfortune, but can also have a real impact on social dynamics.
Right, and it's important to remember that these beliefs aren't just abstract ideas. They're embedded in the daily lives and lived experiences of these cultures.
This is all really eye-opening, and I'm curious to know more about how religion fits into all of this. So what does the research say about how different religious views approach the evil eye and witchcraft?
That's a great question, and something the research dives into as well. Let's start with the Greek Orthodox Church. They actually acknowledge the evil eye as a real phenomenon,
Mm.
but they discourage what they consider superstitious solutions.
So like, they believe in the evil eye, but they don't think you should run out and buy a lucky charm to ward it off.
Right. Instead, they emphasize spiritual remedies, like prayer
Okay.
and seeking blessings from priests. They even have a specific practice called zimatiasma, which is essentially a prayer for removing the effects of the evil eye.
Okay, so it's like a spiritual cleansing ritual.
Exactly. Now, in Africa, the relationship between Christianity and traditional beliefs in witchcraft has been a bit more complex.
Yeah.
Initially, Christian missionaries saw these beliefs as incompatible with their faith and tried to suppress them.
That makes sense given the whole good versus evil thing, but how did African communities respond to that?
It's important to remember that for many African communities, these beliefs weren't just superstitions, but were deeply intertwined with their culture and worldview.
Yeah.
So there was some pushback against the missionaries' attempts to completely erase those traditions.
So a clash of cultures, basically.
Yes. And what's interesting is that over time, a kind of blending occurred. African independent churches emerged, and they incorporated elements of those traditional beliefs, including ideas about spiritual healing and protection from evil forces.
So it wasn't a complete rejection of either system,
No.
but more of a merging of beliefs.
Exactly. And this leads us back to a crucial point that research raises: Western ethnocentrism.
Wait, remind me what ethnocentrism is again.
It's essentially the tendency to view other cultures
Mm.
through the lens of your own,
Mm-hmm.
often assuming that your way of thinking is superior or the only right way.
Mm-hmm.
And the research argues that this can lead to a misunderstanding and even dismissal of beliefs like the evil eye and witchcraft.
So it's like saying, oh, we don't believe in that in our culture, so it must be nonsense.
Yes, and the research cites a scholar named Robaugh, who points out that this even happens with the Bible itself.
What?
People often interpret it through their own cultural lens, which can distort its original meaning.
Okay, so how does this ethnocentrism play out in relation to the evil eye and witchcraft?
Well, Western cultures tend to prioritize scientific explanations. If something can't be measured or observed, it's often dismissed as superstition or folklore.
But in cultures where the spiritual realm is seen as just as real as the physical world, those beliefs make perfect sense, right?
Exactly. And the research argues that we need to be mindful of this when trying to understand different cultural beliefs. Another scholar mentioned Russell,
Okay.
outlined 7 reasons why Western cultures often reject the idea of a personified evil like Satan.
Hmm.
And what are those reasons? Is this reliance on science as the only valid source of knowledge?
So it's like we're shutting ourselves off from a whole dimension of human experience by clinging so tightly to our scientific worldview.
Yes, and this can prevent us from appreciating the complexity and depth of other cultures.
Now, this is where things get really interesting for me. The research actually suggests that Christianity, despite its initial clashes with these traditional beliefs, might offer an alternative perspective on dealing with evil.
Yes. The argument is that instead of relying on amulets or rituals, Christians can find ultimate protection and security in their faith in Jesus.
So it's like saying that instead of trying to ward off evil with external objects or practices, true protection comes from an internal spiritual connection.
Exactly, and this is where the research encourages us to think beyond our own cultural biases and assumptions. It's not about saying one belief system is right and the other is wrong. It's about recognizing that different cultures have developed different ways of coping with the mysteries of life and death, good and evil.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from envy-fueled glances to spiritual interpretations of misfortune. But before we wrap things up, I'm curious to dig a little deeper into how the evil eye and witchcraft, despite their similarities, actually differ in practice and impact.
Let's do that. One key distinction the research highlights is the level of violence associated with witchcraft beliefs, particularly in Africa.
Right, you mentioned earlier that accusations of witchcraft can lead to suspicion and mistrust. But can you give me a concrete example of how that plays out?
Sadly, there have been cases of violence against those accused of witchcraft, sometimes even leading to death.
Wow, that's a stark contrast to the evil eye, which seems more focused on social regulation and subtle forms of control.
Exactly. Another interesting point of comparison is the way different cultures try to protect themselves from these evil forces.
Okay.
In Greece, as we mentioned, it's often about amulets and avoiding envious glances.
Right.
But in some African traditions, it's about muti.
Hold on. Refresh my memory on what muti is.
It's a term used for traditional medicine, but it can also be used for protection or to inflict harm. And what's fascinating, a bit unsettling, is that muti can sometimes involve using parts of animals or even humans.
Oh, wow. In rituals.
Okay.
That's definitely intense and not something you'd typically see with the evil eye.
Right, and this is where we need to be cautious about ethnocentric judgments. What might seem horrifying or irrational to us can have deep cultural and spiritual significance in another context.
This makes me think about the article's concluding points, about Christianity offering a different way to approach evil. But wouldn't that be seen as imposing Western religious beliefs on other cultures?
That's a valid concern, and it's important to approach interfaith dialogue with sensitivity and respect.
Yeah.
The research wasn't advocating for forced conversions or dismissing the value of other belief systems.
So what's the takeaway then?
It's about recognizing that different cultures have different ways of dealing with the complexities of good and evil, and perhaps there's room for dialogue and understanding, even if we don't fully agree on the methods.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface of a very complex topic.
I agree, and it's a reminder that there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, and more bridges to build between cultures.
You know, as we've been talking about the evil eye and witchcraft, it's striking how these beliefs, though so different on the surface, are both responses to very human concerns.
Absolute, whether it's fear of envy, a need to explain misfortune, or a desire for protection. These beliefs offer a framework for understanding and navigating the world.
And it's fascinating how those frameworks are shaped by the specific challenges of each culture. Like the evil eye acting as a sort of social pressure valve in resource-scarce ancient Greece.
Right, encouraging people to be mindful of their good fortune and not trigger those envious vibes.
And then in Africa, witchcraft beliefs, while sometimes leading to those really disturbing outcomes we discussed, also provide a way to make sense of hardship and seek solutions within a spiritual context.
It's a reminder that beliefs don't exist in a vacuum. They're intertwined with history, social structures, and the environment.
I'm thinking back to that point the research made about Christianity, potentially offering a different perspective on evil. It's a tricky idea, right? Because on the one hand, it feels a bit presumptuous to suggest that one religion has all the answers.
It definitely requires a lot of nuance and sensitivity. The research wasn't advocating for imposing beliefs on anyone. It was more about highlighting the potential for cross-cultural dialogue and understanding.
Like maybe instead of focusing on the differences in our beliefs, we can look for common ground in our shared human experiences.
Precisely. We all grapple with questions of good and evil, suffering and justice, and how to find meaning and purpose in a world that can often feel chaotic.
It's like maybe instead of asking who's right and who's wrong, you can ask what can we learn from each other?
And that brings me to the final thought I want to leave you with. This whole deep dive has really underscored the importance of cultural humility.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
It's about recognizing that our own cultural perspectives are just that. Our perspectives. They're not the only way of seeing the world. And they're certainly not inherently superior to other ways of knowing and being.
So it's like acknowledging that we all have blind spots and being open to having our assumptions challenged.
Exactly. It's about approaching other cultures with curiosity and respect, recognizing that we have as much to learn as we have to teach.
That's a powerful message, and it feels especially relevant in our increasingly interconnected world.
It is, because when we open ourselves up to different perspectives, we expand our own understanding of what it means to be human.
This has been an incredible journey, from envious glances to complex spiritual traditions. And I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for the diversity of human beliefs.
It's been a pleasure diving into this research with you. And remember, the learning doesn't stop here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around you with an open mind and a compassionate heart.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this fascinating deep dive. And until next time, keep learning and keep growing.